Reload your three-bladed sword. Get comfortable in your leather kirtle or your chainmail bikini. Fire up the wizard van. It's about to get weird. You're listening to Swords Against Madness, a hybrid of storytelling and solo OSR gaming. I am both dungeon master and players in a world of weird fiction and pulpy sword and sorcery. The dice create a narrative, and I will turn it into a psychedelic story for your enjoyment. There's no cheating, no special rules to make life easier for my player characters. Just the game, the dice, and a few oracles to help keep things moving along. I will try to keep it PG-13, or at least what PG-13 meant when I was a kid. There will be a little innuendo, and maybe a little over-the-top comic book violence. If it wouldn't have appeared in Goonies or Gremlins, you won't hear it here. Now, it's time to party like it's 1974. With Swords Against Madness. In episode 3 of Swords Against Madness, Miria found herself facing a conundrum. In order to destroy the Gorum, the immortal space barbarians that had been raiding the village, she needed a magic weapon. The only one available belonged to a miser named Kalmek, who lived down the shore. A man whose religion has told him that the local faith, the Order of the Stars, was heresy, and believed that anything that might help Miria attain her quest to wake the All-Knowing would be a betrayal of his faith. With the help of Olan and Rayya, Miria tried to convince Kalmek to give up the dagger, but the price he asked was sabotaging the All-Knowing, whatever that is. Frustrated and furious, Olan, Rayya, and Miria decided to steal the dagger. Rayya unleashed a torrent of verbal abuse against Kalmek to distract him, while Olan broke in his seaside windows and attempted to steal the dagger. Unfortunately, Olan knocked over some china, and Kalmek's reaction was swift and violent. He attempted to beat Rayya with a cane. Unfortunately for him, Rayya was stronger and faster than he was. She caught him by the wrist, twisted his arms around behind him, knocked him to the ground, and ground his face into the gravel, while Olan retrieved the dagger, and they left him sobbing in the gravel. Now they returned to the village to destroy the Gorum with their ill-gotten gains. Miria examined the dagger in her hand, turning it over, admiring it. No wonder Kalmek didn't want to give it up. It was a true thing of beauty. The hilt was a golden statue of a woman, nude above the waist, and draped in elegant skirts, her head thrown back in an aspect of ecstasy, long hair flowing down her back, her arms outstretched. She was encased in some kind of clear resin that made the statue almost perfectly visible. It must have been treated alchemically because it remained transparent even though the dagger was clearly very old. In places, the resin had been intentionally roughed, creating cloudy bands around the statue so that it wouldn't slip in your hand. The pommel was a blossom of a strange red metal, with a swollen golden pistol at its heart. It was arranged so that it seemed to be resting in the woman's upstretched palm, even though it was not attached to her and rested outside the resin. The crossguard was made of the same bright red metal, simple geometric patterns across the guard. She drew it. The blade flared out in a pair of curves, making it wider than the tang at the base, and then descended, plunged into a razor-sharp triangle of ringing metal. On either face of the blade, the same figure was etched with acid in elaborate detail. Miria could feel the warp humming through the thing's molecular matrix. She didn't recognize the vibration. The enchantment was strange, but then so was all magic on this world. She turned it over in her hands a couple of times delicately, then gripped it hard and turned her attention to the Gorum. The creatures were still struggling against their bonds. They had rubbed themselves raw, skinless, and bloody in places trying to break free. Some had broken their teeth or their fingers trying to get out. They didn't care. It would always grow back. She took a ragged breath and reminded herself of a video she'd seen years ago where the Gorum had been released on a space station and butchered everyone aboard. Then whoever deployed them sucked the air out of the station to knock them out, so that they could be rebound, because there was no way they were giving up on torturing their captives otherwise. The grim work, she'd called it in her head. Grim, but necessary. Rayya looked at her with her wide eyes and asked for a moment,
"Do you want me to do it?"
Miria shook her head. It was time to play the bad guy again. She took a few steps to the nearest Gorum, grabbed it by the hair, raised the dagger, and thrust it hard into the creature's skull. There was a pulse, an inner light inside its head, and then finally it was still. The gathered crowd gasped and murmured, uncomfortable with what they'd just seen. Miria simply moved on to the next one, and then the next one, letting her mind float away from the task at hand. I think I just lost my ability to complain when my player characters act like murder hobos. Theft and cold-blooded executions isn't exactly what I had in mind when I started the campaign. It's funny the places it takes you. As a player, I desperately want to push Miria in a more positive direction. She might be willing to play the bad guy, but I don't want to play the bad guy for very long. It is absolutely not what I'm here to do. I think in her heart of hearts, Miria has made a vow to help these people, to awaken the all-knowing, and use whatever technology the Trassi have left behind to help them build a better life, especially in the face of all of this. She only wishes she could take her time doing it, maybe teach them something. Except she's got that nasty case of radiation poisoning that's going to keep her moving. And from now on, she's going to have to think twice every time she plays the bad guy. This is actually why I love the alignment system in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. That little grid that everyone ignores in the back of the book with all the overlapping circles. Seeing your character sliding around on that could make you really, really carefully choose your decisions. Shifting away from the alignment you had established for the character had penalties, losses of experience points, among others. And as a DM, I don't care how desperate you feel your character is. Some things are stepping across a line, and Miria, she's been towing it a long time. Let's see if both she and I can straighten up and fly right from now on. That is, assuming the dice are going to play nice with me. If not, I'll console myself with the fact that, like my favorite characters, Kugel and Elric, I may be playing the bad guy, but I'm about to screw over people who are far worse. For a couple of years now, I've been working on and off on a retro clone of AD&D that keeps as close to the original rules as it can, but is reorganized and rewritten to be a lot easier to read. Kind of like Osric, but with tones of old-school essentials. And while it's nowhere near ready, and may never be, I do love its alignment system. And while I was cross-indexing everything I could find on alignment, I finally figured out how to use that diagram, and redrew it in a way that I thought would be more useful. While I'm playing a 3-axis alignment Law-Chaos neutrality here, it might still be interesting for us rules nerds. And it also means that I can use a similar, very simple system for tracking just how far Miria is sliding towards chaos herself. In the meantime, with the Gorum down, her most immediate problem is solved. Now Miria can go back to worrying about whether or not she's cooking alive from the inside. Let's see what Mythic has to say about what we're going to do next. That's interesting. Miria sat on the pebbled beach and sulked, staring out at the gray waves, letting the drizzle wash over her. She turned the dagger over in her hand. She couldn't see any trace of blood on it. It's like it had just drank it all up. Not a great sign. Right now, she desperately wanted to be alone. Not on a planet alone where there's life all around you, but truly alone in the empty void. She tried to remember that time she spent just meditating, drifting, staring at the Witchhead Nebula. But when she closed her eyes, all she could see was Gorum and blood. And somewhere in the back of her mind was the tick-tick-ticking of the Geiger counter. She could feel the wide, staring eyes of Rayya on her from somewhere in the underbrush. Rayya understood that Miria needed her space, but also had a duty to keep an eye on her. She tried to tune it out. It would seem that the universe didn't want her to be alone, no matter how bad she wanted it. Even as she stared out at the waves, she could make out a disturbance in the water. And then a mind reached out to touch her. The strange, half-formed thoughts of the psisquid again. For a moment it flashed an image of the box she'd sent her to get, and then of a cloud of floating wrappers on the surface of the sea. It was hoping she could give it directions. She could tell that much. After a moment, it sent out a pulse of sympathy as if it could detect her pain, even if it couldn't understand it. Miria took a moment to half-heartedly form an image of the Imperial's galley, and try to show it where she kept the food. It still lingered on the surface, raising a tentacle up like a sea serpent out of the grey water. Apparently, it considered her a friend of sorts. And like many creatures that lived its whole life with psychic powers, it didn't understand the appeal of isolation. There is nothing more alien to a hive mind than the desire for solitude. At least, trying to make it happy and make it go away was a challenge. She spent her time in detail visualizing places where it might find food in her ship, and trying her best to reassure it that she would be okay, even though she was getting the creeping suspicion that she was lying to herself. After a few minutes of this game, she resolved herself to her strange company, and got comfortable just exchanging thoughts and images, meaningless impulses, snippets of feelings with the psisquid. And then she was taken by surprise when a comm call came in across her gauntlet. Cautiously, she opened a channel.
Hello? Who is this?
Well. By my third wife's eggs. Miria Kano, you really are alive. Ha!
A hologram of a blue face, tusks, tiny red eyes, manifested in front of her. This was Yanghu, one of her connections in the Trassi Syndicate. A smuggler, and a real piece of work. At least now she knew who had shot her down. Now if only she could remember exactly why.
I'm afraid it's going to take a little more than plasma torpedoes and re-entry to do me in, Yanghu. Why are you calling me now?
To gloat, of course. Huh. Gloating is one of the greatest pleasures the universe has to offer. Most people are too polite to enjoy it, however. Look at you down there, a mess. And if I can trust these signals I've intercepted, it would seem that you drank a pretty good dose of reactor coolant. Perhaps it would have been easier for you if you had just let yourself burn up. Tell me, is your ship's sensor still working?
Miria furiously wished that they were. She was already desperately manipulating holograms trying to pinpoint his location. His signal didn't feel orbital. Yanghu had to be somewhere nearby. Probably not on the island, but close enough that it might give her a shot. But without Imperial, this would be tricky. She considered whether or not to wake him up, but she decided she needed to keep those 16 minutes, at least for now. In a desperation move, she reached out to the psisquid and asked it, "Can you find him?" She could feel the psisquid reaching out its mind, trying to pinpoint Yanghu for her. But the moment it brushed up against his foul mind, the creature let out a pulse of terror and fled deep into the water, gone.
Do not strain yourself, Miria. Not on mine account, nor terrorize your poor little animal. It can't take the dirty thoughts that I think.
I take it that you're not interested in offering me a lift, Yanghu. So what then?
But threat. Stay away from our caches. If I catch you playing with my merchandise, well, if you survive it, I will make sure that the next time you enter an orbit, you won't have a spaceship around you.
I'm not interested in your merchandise. I didn't think you were low enough to trade in filth hounds.
Up, down, it's all the same in space. Didn't you remember that?
Business is business, huh? All right, I have a business proposal for you, Yanghu.
Oh, this ought to be delicious. Do continue.
If you're not going to offer me a ride off this rock, I need a med kit, a good one. You're willing to drop that off the coast of the island I'm on, I'll tell you where I keep my caches. I have about 27 of them, all within 3 jumps of here. About 500,000 credits in gray market merchandise. What do you say?
I say I'll find them eventually anyway. Glad that you decided to inform me of how many and where to look. You can cook on the inside, Miria. No dice.
You're making a big mistake, Yanghu. A big mistake.
Oh, I really don't think I am. Enjoy dying slowly on that rock. Assuming the natives don't eat you first. Adieu, Miria.
Frustrated, Miria grabbed a fistful of gravel and threw it into the water with a growl. Not that it helped. The dagger in her hand suddenly felt cool, light, comforting. She especially enjoyed visualizing jabbing it into Yanghu's chest a few times. He had 4 hearts. It would take a while, but that would only make it more satisfying. Then she tamped down on those thoughts. Was that her? Or the dagger? She really hoped it was the dagger. In any case, she decided to use that fire for something useful. She pulled herself up off the rocks and walked stiffly up to where she knew Rayya was lurking.
Let's go get Olan and plan our next step. It's time to get to work waking up this all-knowing of yours.
Are you looking for a D&D podcast with a dark side? Something more like Game of Thrones and less like Monty Python? Tale of the Manticore is part dark fantasy audio drama, part solo D&D RPG. There's no plot armor here. The dice make all the important decisions. Join me as I resurrect the excitement, wonder, and emotion of old-school D&D. Made for a mature audience, Tale of the Manticore is both a fiction and a game. It's the story where chaos rolls.
Now that was unexpected. The Mythic Game Master emulator is my oracle of choice for solo gaming these days. It is a little more dynamic than just using a D6 system or a set of symbols. One of my favorite things about it is a tool called the Chaos Factor. As you complete scenes in the game, you evaluate whether the player characters were in control or whether they were losing control of the scene, and that gives you a number between 1 and 10. Every time you move on to a new scene, you roll a d10. If it's under the chaos factor and odd, the scene changes. It happens a way you didn't expect. If it's under the chaos factor and even, another scene interjects itself first, some kind of encounter. And then there are a series of random D100 tables to tell you exactly how that works. You also keep a series of D10 tables for NPCs you're running into and various threads that are running through the campaign that might be referenced. The chaos factor in the game right now is fluctuating pretty much between 3 and 5. The campaign started off as a wild ride and reached up towards a 6, but more recently it's kind of evened out, and between Rayya's competence and the way the party manages to solve their problems, it crept back down to about a 3. I wasn't expecting things to change much, and I wanted to do a dramatic scene where Miria sat and thought about what she was doing, and maybe figure out something I'd rolled a few days ago. Namely that the dagger she stole is cursed, and now she's stuck with it. This -2 dagger will make her pretty much completely ineffective at self-defense. What's worse is that it so desperately wants to be used that every time she reaches for a weapon she must make a saving throw, or that's what will appear in her hand. This is a dagger that feeds on the helpless, and so she has already managed to make it much, much stronger. But when I rolled against the chaos factor, it told me it had more to reveal, namely that Miria would discover something about who shot her down, which is how I ended up inventing Yanghu. The Trassi isn't just one species, it's a criminal organization, and it incorporates monsters as space travelers. I decided to make Yanghu an Ogre Mage. That's a fairly powerful enemy, one Miria is going to have to build up to if she wants to face him. When I rolled further to see what he wanted, All I got was a sense that he wanted to gloat at Miria, maybe threaten her a bit, and enjoy her misery. I also determined that the Gorum were here because the Trassi have been storing them here. And so at least now we know where they came from. But not yet exactly where the Master fits into all of this. What I have learned is that he isn't one of Yanghu's puppets. The Master is up to his own tricks, and has his own motivations. Aside from that, the chaos factor also determines how likely you are to get a yes or no answer to a question, with the possibility of extreme yeses and extreme nos if you roll exceedingly high or exceedingly low on a D100. The lower your chaos factor is, the generally more likely it is that your questions would be answered with a no. This lets Mythic Game Master emulators self-regulate a bit. If things are getting way out of hand, the questions you ask are more likely to get a yes, allowing you to kind of nudge the campaign back towards equilibrium. If you are well in control, the odds are good that you're going to get a lot of no answers on your dice. In this case, it worked hard against Miria. That low chaos factor meant that every question I asked about can she convince Yanghu to help her out with her radiation, can she convince Yanghu to trade information she has for a way off the planet, can she wheedle information out of Yanghu about what he's keeping on the planet? All of those turned out negative. This really was just an exercise in aggravation. But it's just one more way to prod Miria into moving forward. Accordingly, I've fired up the campaign cartographer program I use for drawing maps, and have created a map of Nar Island, the homeland of Olan and Rayya, and the place Miria is going to have to navigate if she wants to survive. It's a simple volcanic island, roughly Texas-shaped, and not very large across, but full of hills and dense rainforest that are going to make it really difficult to navigate. I also created some random encounter tables, with a mixture of classic monsters and a whole bunch of my own creations. I also peppered the table with some random sci-fi weirdness and the like to keep the vibe going. And while I'm at it, I added in some things like pilgrims going to see the Shrine of the All-Knowing, and members of the church trying to figure out where the All-Knowing is hidden so that they might sabotage it. That way my random encounter table is pretty dynamic. I also am modeling my random encounter table on the ones from the Hot Springs Island modules, which are designed to tell you a lot more than which creature you encounter. They give you a sense of what the creature is doing, if there's mixed groups of creatures, and gives you some sense of how to modify the encounter to make it more interesting. All of which I will post in the show notes for this episode. While they're in transit traveling through the rainforest, I won't be using the Mythic emulator. I am going to keep that vanilla Swords and Wizardry. Every watch, that is, every 4 hours that they're traveling, or every other watch when they're resting, I'm going to roll a d6. On a 1, they encounter something unusual, and then I'll use my tables to figure out what that is. For the first little while, there's no chance of them getting lost. I've decided that Olan counts as having a native guide. I have 2 destinations set in mind for the party. The first is the hidden shrine where the magicians, who still practice the magic taught them by the Trassi, the group known as the Order of the Stars, keeps their initiated magicians cloistered. That's about 2 hexes away, which is really only 12 miles, but given the rough terrain of hilly rainforest, it might be a full day of journeying. Then from there, if they get the approval, they'll head up the mountain and find the hidden shrine of the All-Knowing. These are 2 of the 5 locations I've already put on the map. Every time the party enters a new hex, I'm going to give them a chance of finding something interesting, an unusual location, an adventure site, or a clue. I will crib a lot of those ideas from a tool called Filling in the Blanks, which is a book on filling in hexes as you crawl them. And I will take a few more notes from Hot Springs Island as I go. Hopefully that will make travel interesting, dynamic, and let it build up the world as we go. But that's enough meta for now. Let's get back to the action. They started out early the next morning, earlier than Rayya was accustomed to by a fair site, and she was sure to let them both know it. But Olan was keen to get Miria where she was going and prove his worth once and for all to the Order of the Stars. Miria was marching like a woman possessed over roots and under branches, as if she could face Yanghu down and smite him with a single blow, if she could just get there quick enough. They walked exchanging few words with one another for quite some time. It wasn't until their legs were burning and their back was aching that Miria finally agreed to take a break. She threw herself hard against a nearby tree as if it had given her some offense, and then pulled away, grunting as she realized she'd become covered with a sticky, slightly caustic sap. Then she finally looked up and saw the worried expression on Rayya and Olan's eyes, and realized just how rude and aggressive she'd been. She let out a calming sigh, taking a moment to visualize a nebula in her head.
I'm sorry, Olan. I don't know what came over me. I didn't have a good night's sleep, and I had bad news before I settled down. Here I have an expert on these jungles, and I didn't even ask you what I should be looking out for. Half the time I've been leading, and I have no idea where I'm going. Why don't you tell me what I should be looking out for?
Well, the sap of that tree, for one. You're going to need to wash that off before we keep moving. It'll give you a terrible rash. Other than that, most of the dangerous creatures tend to live slightly lower down or slightly higher up. When you stay on this kind of level of ground, you're not going to run into much. It's the dark, dank places that most of the creatures in the lower forest like, and the high, windy places of the creatures in the upper forest like. But don't go climbing any trees, and don't go sticking your hand in any hollows.
That seems fair advice. Look, guys, I just want to say...
Miria decided to show her two companions a little trust. She told them about her encounter with Yanghu over the comm. She told them about Imperial and how little time he has left, and how she doesn't know when to spend and when not to spend that precious resource. She told them about the immense comforts and technologies she was used to having on board the ship, and how hard she was finding it to do even some of the most basic things without the aid of automation. Her voice, her agitated movements, something about the energy she was giving off, however, drew eyes. Massive, hungry, compound eyes from the nearby underbrush. Within moments, the cold, mechanical minds to which those eyes were connected made a decision, and the foliage exploded with motion. Before any of them could even fully turn, 3 massive centipedes, ranging between 7 and 9 feet long, exploded from the underbrush. One of them rammed into Rayya and pinned her to the ground, rearing up with scythe-like mandibles dripping with venom. A second plowed into Olan before he could even get his hands on his blades. The creatures opened their mouths and chittered for a moment before plunging in to strike. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Swords Against Madness. As always, it's been a wild ride, and I am grateful to you for coming and listening to it. There is a lot of companion material I generated over the course of this adventure. You can find it in the show notes at swordsvmadness.stormheadproductions.ca, where I keep monster stats, magic items, and other content I create for the game, along with maps, character sheets, and even samples of my role-playing games. I also love hearing from my audience. You can reach me on Twitter at swordsvmadness. The music in this podcast is generated by me, Brian C. Rideout, using Suno AI, and is available for download either on swordsvmadness.stormheadproductions.ca or on Suno, where you can find me under the username Donut Elemental. I would love to be able to read reviews at the end of every podcast, and I'm going to start with one from Simon Williams, who's the creator of Legend of the Bones, and here on this show the voice of the AI of the Imperial's coin. Simon writes, "A fantastic solo actual play podcast. Swords Against Madness takes this genre and turns it into a science fantasy gonzo extravaganza. Just watch out for those immortal space barbarians. Highly recommended for anyone wishing to party like it's 1974. Thanks so much, Simon. You've been a huge inspiration to me. If you're interested in supporting the show, you can make a small one-time donation using PayPal on my homepage. Or if you're like me and you'd like to buy something, I have a number of products on DriveThruRPG and itch.io through my imprint Death Trap Games. You can learn more about that on my blog, Welcome to the Death Trap. which you can find at deathtrapgames.blogspot.com. And if you just want to shoot the breeze about podcast production, it's one of my favorite topics, and you can reach me at brian@stormheadproductions.ca. Until next time, play hard, roll high, and think weird.